I am used to speaking to a much younger audience, like 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds. And my conversation is basically going to be the same as I do to young people. There's a saying that says that sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Most young people have never heard of that expression, so I tried to explain it to them. I think that words is the cause of most of our problems. It starts with words. And what I try to do, and I try to plead with young people, to be careful how they use words. My objective is to try to reach them, to try and instill into them the idea that they're much stronger, much smarter than they give themselves credit for. Since I started doing this, I've learned to respect young people a great deal, because the way I touch them, or perhaps the way they touch me. I get letters from young people that's enough to break your heart, because they have problems, and we don't realize that. And we happen to put them in one particular bag, and each one is an individual. And the way they express themselves is unbelievable. And that's why I feel so strong about talking to young people. And furthermore, I feel that this is our future. If we're ever going to change, if we're ever going to stop killing one another, it has to start with them. So frankly, that's my appeal. I also tell them why, after 60 years, are people like myself standing in front of the group, opening up our hearts and speaking to them about something that happened. It was almost unspeakable. I was 10 years old when I went to hiding. And frankly, when I was a young man, I didn't want to deal with it, didn't want to talk about it. Tried to avoid the whole subject. But as I got older, perhaps I got either smarter or dumber, I don't know which. I volunteered to give a talk once, and for the last 10 years, this is all I've been doing. I feel it's an obligation for people like myself to speak out, because if not us, then who? In a very short period of time, there are not going to be any survivors left. And are we going to be just a comma or just a half a sentence in World War II? Or are people going to remember what happened? What people, educated, informed people are able to do to one another? What does it say about us as human beings? To be able to take a child and throw it out of a window, or put it into an oven, and go home to your family and be nice to your wife and children, and go to church and pray to God, because you're convinced you're doing the right thing. You're convinced that you're getting rid of the vermin of this earth. Did you? And that's the way it was. So the point being is, what have we learned? We're still killing one another right now, this very minute. In Darfur, we did it in Bosnia. We called it ethnic cleansing instead of genocide or the Holocaust. We did it in between the Hutus and the Tutsis. It's still going on. And we keep saying never again. So I ask young people to participate, not to be bystanders, because the bystanders become just as guilty as the ones that participate in the crimes. Had the German general public stood up and said it was wrong, none of this would have happened, not to that scale. But speak to the general population after the war, and I was in Germany after the war. Nobody knew anything about it. And if you want to believe that, I'll tell you another story. It wasn't my ox that was being gored, so I really didn't care. There's a gentleman by the name of Niemauer that said first they came to for the communists, and I wasn't one, so I didn't care. Then they came for the labor unionists, and I wasn't one, so I didn't get involved. And then they came for the Jews. I was not Jewish. And the next, they came for me. And by that time, there was nobody there to care. So we must be cautious. It affects all of us, directly or indirectly, and we can all make a difference. We say to ourselves, well, what can I do as a human being, as one person? One person can change the world. One person took a chance, and I'm here standing in front of you as an old man with a wife and children and grandchildren because one person took a chance and saved my life. So my appeal to whether it's young or old, we've got to participate. And this country is not immune from anything that could possibly happen. We can't kid ourselves. Get the wrong people into office, and this country can go in a totally different direction. I'm not going to get into the political situation as to what is happening right now. So, vote is important. Expression is important. When Hitler came into power, he didn't invade Germany with tanks and an army. He was voted into office. And the general population just became immune to it and let it happen. And in the process, over 12, the figure is really not known exactly, but the figure that's been used that over 12 million people were slaughtered, murdered, in some unspeakable ways. This particular hate was for Jews. And he wrote a book saying that he was going to do those things, but nobody believed him. There's something about us as human beings, we will not accept finality. I know if people were walking to the trains into what was known as the gas chambers, still praying and hoping that God will intervene and help, or some miracle was going to happen. 1.5 million were children, no different than the children that I speak to. And I ask them to think about not the numbers, not 12 million or 6 million or 1.5 million. I ask them to think about one child. One child is dear to them, a brother or a sister or a cousin, or in your case, a grandchild or a child. And the Holocaust takes on a totally different meaning. I've lived with my loss of my parents, my grandparents, my uncles, my aunts, most of my life. But there's one thing that sticks in my craw is my little 6-year-old sister. That I cannot get rid of. So what I'd like to do is get into the middle of my story, if I can find it, and read to you basically some of the things that happened to me. And then if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. In fact, what I don't answer, I finally was able to get my book published about my life history, and I brought a few in case somebody's interested. It's September 1942, and I'm 10 years old. The Gestapo and the Ukrainian soldiers surround our ghetto and start the final killings, the liquidation of the Jewish people that are still left alive. It happens to be the morning after the Day of Atonement, which naturally, you know, is a high holiday. My parents, my little sister Sarah, and I are hiding on the second floor of our building in a double wall, including many of our neighbors. It's very scary. Everyone's afraid. The hiding place was built to disguise the entrance to the attic, and there must be at least 40 or more people in this attic with us. Families with small children. Everyone's being told to be quiet. The killers are roaming the streets of the ghetto searching for any remaining Jews that are hiding. The ones that they find. Some are shot immediately. Some are chased to the back of our house where there used to be a potato field. A big hole was dug, and men, women, and children are shot and thrown into that hole and buried. Some still alive. Guards are marching back and forth, hitting people, cursing them, calling them dirty scum, filthy Jews. We know that all these people will be killed. We also know that the same fate awaits us if we are discovered, and that's why we are hiding. I watch as people are being chased down a small hill from Rogovska Street, which is a street where my parents had their shop, to the back of a house, where a mass grave was dug. As we sit in this hiding place, it becomes unruly. People are telling one another to keep quiet so we're not discovered. Children are crying, and mothers are being told to keep them quiet. It's something that I'm going to tell you which I had a rough time trying to express because I felt it was inappropriate, but I watch and disbelieve when a hand is placed down on a child's face to deaden the noise, and soon there is silence, total silence. I dare not cry or make a sound, but my body's in constant quiver as fear of death and of pain totally consumes me. I build up a tremendous fear of dying for what I saw in what was going on in the ghetto. I'm afraid that all of us will die. My parents are sitting next to me, making sure that my little sister Sarah doesn't utter a sound. And soon I hear footsteps over a hiding place. Soon the opening of the hiding place is ripped away in screams of dirty Jews or verfluchte Juden. Out with you, you dogs. They shoot into a hiding place. Some people are dead, some are wounded. People are lying all around me, bleeding. I know these people. They are neighbors. They've done nothing wrong. They are like me, just like me. A bullet hits the wall where I'm sitting, and a splinter breaks off and gets embedded in my upper lip, and blood is running into my mouth. My parents are climbing out of the hiding place. My dad has Sarah in his arms, and I'm right behind him. His bag shields me from the blows of the Ukrainian guards. As we are chased down the stairs, a guard pulls my mother out of line, and naturally we don't know what's going to happen to her. Guards with clubs are hitting people. People are being smashed against the wall. I watch a Gestapo shoot one of the older women in our hiding place. Blood is running from her head as she collapses to the ground. I'm standing next to my dad. Guards are walking back and forth, barking orders. I try not to look at them. I don't know if you've ever had that experience. If you want to hide and somebody's looking at you, you're looking down on the ground, hopefully that they will not see you. And this is the way I was trying to become invisible. People are being dragged out of their homes, their clubbed, beaten. We are chased up to the main marketplace. The main marketplace in our town was the gathering point for all commerce that was going on. It was one of like equivalent to what you would have today as a shopping center. And people are made to sit in a square. And this was the gathering point before they were being taken to the trains to take them to Treblinka. Fear. Fear of death and pain of dying was terrifying me. My teeth are chattering, my body's convulsing, but the sun was shining on this beautiful September morning. Frightening fear, trembling, uncontrolled convulsion overtook my whole being. Where was God in all this? Why would He allow this to happen? I have no tears, just uncontrollable shaking. My thoughts are about dying, death. Will it be very painful? I'm scared of the pain. I don't want to die. I keep praying to God to spare me. But there, I wonder, why would He save me? There are other children that are much more pious, much better behaved than I, and in my own mind I felt that these are the children who will be saved, but not me. My dad didn't speak, only Sarah cried, the rest were silent. The guards barked their orders and began their assembly of us to the marketplace, to the painful prodding of their clubs. Why didn't God strike these murderers dead? Was there a God? And this is the 10-year-old, because I came from a fairly religious home at that time, and suddenly, in my own heart and mind, all was lost. I wish I could express the fear that was inside of me, knowing that I was going to die a horrible death. I just cannot find the words to do that. An occasional cry would be heard. Some old Jewish person would invoke the Lord's name, Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, but no one listened. We're sitting there waiting to be marched to the trains. I don't want to die. Why were to be sent to our deaths in such a tormented way in the guest chambers of Treblinka? By the way, Treblinka was located about 18 kilometers away from our town. And just as an aside, Treblinka was established only for one purpose. And Treblinka existed only for a 2-year period of time, and in that 2-year period of time, 750,000 men, women, and children were gassed, burned, and their ashes spread into the river and to the fields. And then they tried to disassemble the camp, but evidence still there. I couldn't face the pain that I imagined would come with such a death. I always heard about the pain before you finally died. Why did I have to die? Was I so sinful? A guard sits in the middle of the square with a machine gun, keeps turning it and pointing it at everyone. No one knows who will be shot. Other Gestapo guards are walking around us, beating people. They're not lined up exactly right. I wrote something about my little sister Sarah, which I'll probably read to you at the end. My father tells me that I should run and try to escape. Maybe I could make my way to where my older sister Irene has been hidden. You see, before the liquidation, my parents had placed Irene with a Polish couple by the name of Gursky. She was smuggled out of the ghetto, and the couple were paid. I don't know exactly what the arrangement was, but there was a monetary arrangement for the Gurskys to take in Irene. And I did know where Irene was being hidden. It was a small town. It wasn't too far from the ghetto. So I pushed myself behind the line of people sitting and facing the guards with the automatic weapons. Keeping low to the ground, I crawl on my stomach behind the people sitting next to me and inch my way slowly till I reach the end of the line where the marketplace ended and the sewer that ran along the street began. I crawl into that sewer and keep crawling till I felt I was out of sight. It seems like it takes forever. Will they see me? Will they shoot me? My mind and heart are racing. Finally, I stand up and run. Perhaps I won't feel the pain if I'm shot in the back. And this is what I was trained to do, not to run, but to run zigzag, just in case somebody's shooting at you, perhaps they would miss you. No one's shooting at me, no one's chasing me. To this day, I don't understand why. But perhaps there was too much commotion going on for anybody to notice me. I felt I certainly did not deserve such good fortune. I ran into the cellar of a house that belonged to one of my uncles. My aunt and her little daughter were hiding in that cellar in that house. I hid there with them that day, the balance of the day and that night, and the next morning I told them we have to get out of here. They're going to come, they're going to do another search, and they're going to kill us. But she was just frozen with fear to move. Next morning, I sneak out of the house and run to the backyard where the barbed wire fence surrounded the ghetto. I recall standing in the backyard of my Uncle Abram's house, looking at the barbed wire fence and a Polish woman standing across in the free zone. Was waving at me, yelling in Polish, "Chodź, come." So I went to the barbed wire, making sure there were no Gestapo guards in the vicinity. And I have a picture of this old woman with a babushka on her head, coming up to the wire fence, lifting up one of the strands of wire to help me get under the barbed wire. I lift the thorny strands of wire, bend real low, and crawl through the sharp-edged wires. And in the process, I caught my leg just on one of the sharp edges. And my leg was bleeding, but my fear was much greater than the pain I could possibly feel. I ran down Ulica Piękna, which is the street we used to live in, and just as a translation, Piękna is beautiful. But I don't recall the street being beautiful, but that's what they called it. And I turned to the fields and I started running to a farm called Sabnia. Why did I go to Sabnia was a little hazy to me, but then later on I realized that we were in Sabnia. My parents were pulled out of the ghetto to forced labor at Sabnia, and we all stayed in this big barn for some odd reason. At the beginning, they allowed to take their children with them. So I remember staying in the barn and roaming around there when my parents were working the fields. So I knew if there were some survivors, perhaps they would be there. So I ran through the fields to try to make it there. And naturally, every time I hear a vehicle in the background, I would flatten myself in the field, because any vehicle would be Germans or Gestapo looking for Jews, because the general population did not have any motorized vehicles. I recall wearing my short pants and a beige coat I believe belonged to my sister. Fear and a sense of desperation and total abandonment consumed me. I surely will be killed. How am I going to survive all alone? I'm devastated. And yet I finally make it to Sabnia. You know, in the process I built up such a low esteem of myself that it got to a point where I didn't even feel or felt that I had the right to survive. And if you tell a person or a child that you're worthless and useless long enough, it works. There's some other survivors there in Sabnia that tell me that my mother is still alive. What happened when she was pulled out of line? She was placed on a work detail. After they gathered all the Jewish people and sent them to Treblinka, or some that they killed, they left close to 50 people as a work detail. And their job was to clean up the ghetto, pack up all the belongings that the Germans wanted. And naturally, we knew what the ending was going to be. When they didn't need them anymore, they were going to kill them. I find my mother, and she hid me in one of the buildings, and at night she would scrounge up some food, some bread, or whatever she could find and bring it to me. And this lasted for a period of time. The gathering, the packing, and train loading of Jewish possessions was to be shipped to Germany was coming to an end, and therefore the balance of the Jewish laborers would be killed, as there was no further need for them. My mother and another man escaped the Gestapo. As the Gestapo detail was pulling up to their station, she and this man, his name was Gedalia, I remember, he used to be our neighbor next door to us. They ran to the place where I was hiding, and we ran out of the ghetto and went into the fields and forest. And we stayed in the forest for a period of time. At night, my mother would go to farmers that used to be our neighbors and friends and beg for food or a place to hide in their barn. Sometimes we were lucky they'd give us some food or a place to hide. Other times, our dear neighbors would turn against us and threaten to turn us over to the Germans. And this went on for a number of months, and it was getting cold, I think into December already, and it gets pretty cold in Poland. And I was getting fairly sick. One evening, my mother would go begging farmers for food and a place to hide. Our hiding together lasted only for a short period of time, and now the weather is getting cold. I'm getting sick. The man that was with us didn't like me, and I felt a tremendous resentment towards him. And the fact is that I resented this man because I felt he was taking my father's place in our life. And boys happen to be jealous of their mothers. I feared and disliked him, and I showed it. He looked at me with indifference and disdain. My being there seemed to threaten their ability to find safety, so he was looking at it from a different standpoint than I was. I was in the way. My mother is pleading with the former neighbor, a farmer, to allow us to hide in his barn one night. And I remember standing next to this man, and she disappears for a while. And when she comes back, she walks up to me. She approaches me and she tells me, "You must go and see if the Gurskis will take you in." She pulls out some jewelry, a ring and a pair of earrings out of her pocket and says, "Give this to the Gurskis or anyone else that would be willing to help you or hide you." I feel totally abandoned. My tears are flowing like rain on my face. My heart is broken. I'm overwhelmed with sadness. That relationship with those thoughts lasted, I'm not going to go into all the detail, lasted with me for an awful long time, probably a good 40, 50 years, till I finally resolved that she did this out of love instead of abandonment. Because had we stayed together, I surely would not have survived. So at the time when you're 10 or 11 years old and your mother tells you to go, it's a tremendously hurtful thing. But I must tell you that I've learned a lot in the last 50, 60 years. I know of occasions, I belong to an organization called the Hidden Children, where mothers on the way to Auschwitz or other death camps squeezed into the cattle cars at 100, 150 at a time, where there was standing room only, and there was only one little window on top in the cattle car, would take their children, not all, in some cases, their babies, push them through that little window while the train was moving, hoping that a child would survive and perhaps a farmer would pick them up and save them, raise them as their own. And there are instances like that. So to question what was happening or why a mother would do this under normal circumstances, sitting right here is really not fair. You have to understand the circumstances. And it took me a long time to overcome that. Fear and a sense of desperation and total abandonment consumed me. I surely will be killed. How am I going to survive all alone? I'm devastated, and yet I wanted to live so desperately. I had a tremendous urge to live. I tried to live on my own. I hide in the woods and I sneak into barns. I dig up potatoes that the farmers buried to keep them from freezing. And those potatoes would become my diet for a period of time. One night in desperation, I knocked on a farmer's door and I asked him and pleaded with him to help me. I was in pretty bad shape by then. He took me into the house and put me into the cellar, and one of his family members brought me some hot milk or some hot soup and a piece of bread. And I handed him the jewelry that my mother gave me. And I was so elated, hoping and thinking that perhaps they would keep me and hide me. But then a couple hours later, I'm asked to come up from the cellar, and I'm told that they're in fear of their lives. But they cannot hide me. They must go. And he made a statement to me which has stuck with me for most of my days. They returned my mother's jewelry to me, and they tell me to give myself up to the authorities. Why? Because there is no longer any future for people like me. We were already eliminated as beings. So I walked back to the ghetto, tramping through open, frozen fields covered with snow. Every step you take causes you pain as your feet get stuck in the mud created by the snow and earth. Each step is difficult, but you continue. It's dark, it's cold, and I'm scared of the barking dogs, and yet I continue. One painful step at a time, and I finally reached the city. I have visions of that every time I travel. I see an open field, and I see myself tramping through those open fields in this type of weather with a pair of short pants. What possesses you to continue today is beyond my thinking. But then when I reach the ghetto, the city, everything is different now. There's nobody left. The streets are empty and eerie. The ghetto is completely dark and silent. It's scary. I walk into one of the empty houses, lay down on the floor, and go to sleep. Next morning early, so no one would see me, I start walking to the Gurskis. No one's in the streets, but even so, I'm still worried that someone will see me and turn me over to the Germans, and that's an absolute fact. They used to have young hoodlums, teenagers or above, run around in packs looking for Jews. And if they find one, they would grab him, turn him over to the Gestapo, and the Gestapo would give him some kind of a word. And their favorite way of recognizing or identifying a Jew was very simple in Poland. all Jews were circumcised. The general population was not. So that's the way you identify them in most cases. Next morning early, so no one would see me, I start walking to the Gurskys. When Mrs. Gursky sees me, she's angry. She yells at me for coming there. She's afraid. And we must understand that anybody caught helping a Jew would automatically be killed. The whole family would be killed. The Germans were not too kindly to the Poles. Their house would be burned. In fact, during World War II, close to 3 million Poles were killed. So to take a risk and take in somebody was an extremely exceptional case. I beg and cry for her to let me hide in her attic, even only for a few days. I'm sick, I'm full of lice and fleas. I beg for her to help me. She finally agrees, and she leads me up to her attic. I take a sack of straw and I put it in the corner where the roof and the floor meet, and she hands me a pail to use as a toilet, and she feels that if I stay in that particular corner, anybody coming up to the landing would not know that I'm there. She lived in a house, a small house, 2 apartments downstairs, and she had a 2-room apartment upstairs. And still at that time, she refused to tell me that my sister was there. She told me that Irene was no longer there. Mrs. Gursky brings me something to eat, a piece of bread and some soup. I eat it eagerly. I wish there was more. Having eaten, I crouch up with my knees against my chest like a little baby and try to keep warm. I'm only wearing a pair of short pants and my sister's long beige coat. And the attic was nothing, the dirt floor and tin plates out of the roof. There was no heat or anything else, no light, no heat. To keep warm, I would stay crouched up in a fetal position on my straw sack. Many a night I would wet myself unknowingly, urinating while I was asleep. And in my sleep it made me feel warm. But then the wetness would freeze and make me shiver because of the semi-frozen urine on my body. Although there are no windows, even so, light shines through the separations of the tin plates. And in the morning, the inside of the roof is totally white with frost and ice that has formed during the night because of the freezing cold. Mrs. Gursky comes back the next day. She brings me some soup, and that became the routine, and a piece of bread. And I remember breaking up that piece of bread into small pieces and putting it in one of my socks to save it for future use. She's angry with me. She's angry at my mother for sending me there. And she calls my mother some hurtful names, which I'll spare you. And she feels that the Germans are going to conquer the whole world because of the propaganda in the newspapers. Initially, Irene was accepted by the Gurskys because I think she thought this would last only for a short period of time, and a girl was easier to disguise as a non-Jew than a boy. I would be more readily recognized, as I told you before, because I was circumcised, so anybody wanted to know if I was Jewish or not, it was very easy. And since my mother chose Irene as the one that could be saved by my coming here, I'm jeopardizing my older sister's existence as well as theirs. So by being here, I'm creating an even more dangerous situation for all of them. And that's why everyone wants me to leave. But then, there was a dichotomy in this thing. She was afraid to throw me out. She didn't want to keep me because she felt if she throws me out and the Germans catch me, they'll beat me up and they'll ask me, where have you been? Because there was no Jewish population left. And I would probably tell them, and they would be killed. Why did she listen to her mother? The news about the war is always bad. And then there's some situations with Mr. Gursky, which we may touch on later. And there, because hunger became my preoccupation with me, she would bring me that piece of bread and some soup. And I was constantly hungry. My stomach would hurt, my stomach would churn. I was daydreaming about food. I used to pretend things were normal. I used to love black bread with butter and sugar on it. I mean, we don't eat it here, but That was the luxury. I used to love that. And my mouth would salivate just thinking about that food. And there in the attic outside the place where the Gurskys live, over near the place where I'm hiding, there's a wooden trough on the landing near the door where leads to her apartment. And in this trough is the place where the Gurskys put all their food scraps, potato peels, and all other garbage that can be chopped up and fed to their pigs. And sometimes at night they use this trough as a place to urinate. He was too lazy to go outside, so he would pee in that thing. And yet, even so, sometimes when they all go to sleep, I sneak out of the place where I'm hiding and I grab a handful out of that trough and eat it in order to lessen the hunger pains that I feel down in my stomach. Mr. Gursky had a couple of apple trees which I used to steal from him, but we won't go into that. So most of the time I sit in silence. All the time I stay in one corner of the attic. I'm always cold and always hungry. Never get to take a bath, cut my hair, brush my teeth. Same clothes for the next 2 years. Hunger gives me terrible pains in my stomach. Will the pain ever go away? When will Mrs. Gursky bring me some food? I always try to remember, what was it like to be full? What a great feeling that would be. Winters were extremely painful, between the freezing cold and the terrible hunger, and that desolate solitude of being alone in the dark and totally filthy place, the desperately lone existence, the long freezing nights on that earth floor, that worn-down sack of straw that was infested with lice and fleas. It took a half a day sometimes just to delouse myself. It all poured such bitter tears from my heart. Why do I have to live in such fear? Why was I hated and destined to die in pain? But then spring would come. My dreams of survival would soon return. Imagining that I would be the only survivor and life would be so exciting, the world would welcome and embrace me. I became this character in this book, and I felt that if I survived, the world would accept me and so on. Ultimately, that dream would fade. The heat of the summer would take over. The sun would bake down on the tin plates of the roof. The attic would become an inferno. The air would be sucked out of that attic. It was impossible to touch the roofing plates. It was an absolute oven. Breathing would become most difficult, but I would lay there totally still, soaked with sweat with the slightest movement. And he would survive another hour, and one more hour, until the evening came and somehow he lived in hope of another day. The rats, the mice would roam at will. Your energy totally sapped, you couldn't care less about your attic mates, whose survival potential was greater than yours. It's hard to imagine what it would be like to live in, to stay in an attic where you're right under the roof, and the roof is made out of tin plates and the heat, the sun beats down on that. And you can cook on it. And there's no air left in the attic. And you lay there. And somehow you survive all that. My days and nights are very lonely. There are no friends for me to play with except when it rains. Rain becomes my welcome friend, and life takes on a temporary new hope. The rain would come down with such great force and make such thunderous noise against the tin plates that I would be able to scream, cry, even sing, and let my pent-up emotions reach the sky, because no one could hear me because of the pounding rain. But then the rain would stop, and the fear and hunger would soon return. And because of total boredom, and wanting to see what the backyard looked like, I would pry open a spot between the plates and the roof and stick something in there so I could look down into the backyard. And one spring day, a little girl caught my attention. She was the daughter of one of the tenants that lived below. And this little girl was eating strawberries. My heart was breaking from the pain and envy. Down there, there's a child eating strawberries, and life seems so normal. Up here, I'm hiding for my life. If I were not Jewish, my life would be like hers, some beset with envy. Why was I born Jewish? Why couldn't I be like her? I will never forget that little girl or the strawberries. There's so many things that happened during that 2-year period of time, but there's 3, 4 things that just won't go away. They just stay in your head. But I'm also filled with dreams. I try to imagine that all of this would soon be over, and that I would see my mother and father and sister again. I tried to imagine that we would all be together again. And then I'm not cold or scared anymore. And I'm not hungry. No more hunger. No more pains in my stomach from not enough of food. And finally, no more loneliness. I lived in that attic for nearly 2 years. Eventually, we're liberated by the Russian army. But then everything is different now. Out of the 6,000 Jewish people that lived in our town, only 29 people survived. Only 2 children survived on their own, my sister Irene and I. My dad dies in the death camp of Treblinka. And my mother survives in hiding with this man, but then 3 months before liberation, Mrs. Skokie comes running up to the attic. She says, they just brought your mother in, tied to a wagon. And she was pregnant. A farmer caught her hiding in his barn. He called his neighbors. They grabbed the 2 of them. They wrestled them to the ground, put them in their manure wagon, tied them with ropes, and brought them into town, turned them over to the Gestapo, and she was shot in the town cemetery. And my little sister Sarah has been breaking my heart for most of my adult life. I don't know, this is affecting me today much more than I anticipated. Dies on the way to the gas chambers of Treblinka. Not knowing exactly how she died, I've created a terrible image of her death, which sometimes I will read and sometimes I won't. Poor Sarah, only 6 years old. My last image of Sarah sitting next to my dad, she had some dried food wrapped in a handkerchief. She thought we were going on a train trip. Long beige stockings and a short dark coat, fear and tears in her eyes, such a beautiful little girl. What torturous death was going to befall my little sister. It's an image that I carry for all my days. Sarah, being pushed into a large room, perhaps 100 or more people under the pretense of taking a shower, where her hair is cut and a piece of soap is put on her hand on the pretense of taking a shower. But instead of water, poison gas pours down on them in order to choke and kill them. And this is a 6-year-old all alone. Nobody there that loves her at her side. The choking gas causes the stronger, the bigger to climb on top of each other, to reach out for the last breath of fresh air that still exists in the gas chamber. And in their struggle, the weaker and the smaller are destined to the bottom of the heap. That struggle causes them to lose control of their bodily functions, and they die in agony. And this is unfortunately the image I have of my little sister Sarah. And that's basically a good portion of my story. And actually, we left Poland ultimately, snuck out of Poland. I got lucky. An uncle of mine showed up that was in the partisans, helped us get out of Poland. We lived in Germany for a while. I lived in, first I lived in some orphanages and then in some displaced persons camps. And I got lucky again. And I was brought to the United States under a children's court, an orphan court. June 7th, 1947, on a boat called the Marine Marlin. And life has been good.